John, people like Ben Bagdikian have written, made very good books about the concentration of ownership of the media and how the control is in fewer and fewer hands. But even if the control were not in fewer and fewer hands, if a lot of people own the media, they'd still be owned by capitalists and they'd be for-profit organizations. Would we see anything much different from what we see now, do you think?
Probably not, although sometimes it depends, of course, always how you define difference. I mean, let's take Fox, for example, which now has a lot of programs very popular with a younger audience. They're different. The Simpsons are different. Mm-hmm. But they're only different in the sense that the three main networks were once described recently, actually in the Wall Street Journal, as the bland leading the bland. And so to that extent, Fox is not bland, and in that sense it's alternative. But if you stand back and say, well, never mind that it's alternative to the networks, does it really give a voice to those people who are habitually shut out of the media? Then of course the answer is no. It's just certain different formats which are, you know, a change of the kaleidoscope in terms of entertainment.
Isn't the tragedy of the American system of media that from the very beginning we've had basically commercial media established in the United States. In Britain and almost every European country, and in most socialist countries and in third world countries, they had state-supported broadcasting, not necessarily state-controlled broadcasting, but state-financed broadcasting, as in Europe, like in Holland and Britain, where you have public corporations that are independent of government set up to try to give broadcasting system that genuinely provides information, that provides a wide range of views and entertainment. At least that's the theory of European media, and to some extent the practice of it. Whereas almost from the beginning we've had commercial corporate media that basically were geared to sell advertising and thus to provide entertainment of the lowest common denominator to attract broad audiences, and that were owned and controlled by corporations that had their own agenda, that is a corporate agenda to strengthen the capitalist system, and that's the system of mainstream media that emerged in the United States, so that we've never really had any, particularly in the broadcasting spectrum, until public access TV, as we will soon see and as the audience is now seeing. But until then, it's basically just been the voices of corporate America that you've heard on broadcasting.
Well, I think the problem is the definition of the airwaves has not looked at the airwaves as a resource like air or water, which are fundamental to any society's health and well-being, and so important that it is inappropriate to leave these simply to the imperatives of making money. A society deserves to have certain resources which cannot be simply contaminated by the logic of profit. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, of course, that typically over here people have assumed that if government is ever involved in media, it is automatically a tremendously constraining force. And I mean, we could have a whole program on this, but there have been so many variations of the forms of state involvement in broadcasting in Europe, from the Dutch system, where it has reflected for a long time the different religious traditions of that society, to the German tradition, whereby after World War II they very determinedly put control over broadcasting at province level instead of at national level, in order to avoid any possibility of an overly strong central government arising and dominating the media system. To the British system, which has had a competitive channels, some state-owned and some commercial. I mean, there are whole varieties of ways of doing this, none of which need involve some kind of top-heavy government interference.
Right.
In the various alternative media, there seemed to be constant political turmoil in all of these, sometimes to the great detriment of these various publications or organizations. Is that endemic to the alternative press?
It's frequent, but I think political turmoil and clashes between people about political issues are pretty normal in political life. But in these media, I think sometimes, particularly in the 70s, in the late 60s and early 70s, I think it was particularly visible perhaps at that point because people had sometimes a very, very sort of instantaneous and simple view of how democracy works. And they thought that by making a kind of like almost a mental religious decision, I mean it wasn't a religious decision, but it was almost like a kind of religious decision saying, okay, we're not going to be hierarchical, we're not going to push each other around, we're going to do this as a democracy inside. And they thought that by making that mental resolution, almost like a New Year's resolution, that somehow everything would fall into place and there wouldn't be any hierarchy emerging. And in a sense what they did was, there's a very interesting argument by a feminist called Jo Freeman called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which is not exactly poetry, but it's an important piece of argument because she says that by denying that there was structure, by denying that there was the possibility of hierarchy, people actually disarmed themselves from recognizing the tendency for some people to boss each other around, you know what I mean? And so people would say, no, no, I'm not being hierarchical, I'm just pursuing our common goals, or whatever, right? But I'm pursuing them better than you are. And so there were all the mechanisms that we tend to use on each other to establish a certain kind of ascendancy, which people were unable to name. The cat, you couldn't bell the cat, because you'd said, well, this doesn't happen, this is them, this is the power structure that behaves like this, we have decided not to, therefore we aren't. And I think that that was a major factor. Another one was that people were not reflective about one particular thing, and that is the practicalities of running one of these shows. I mean, you have to have some kind of practical business sense. I don't mean some advanced commercial accountancy sense, but some practical business sense about how to distribute a newspaper, how to get it printed, how to pay the printers, how to just get all that stuff organized. And very often that was a sign. The people who did that were regarded as the kind of the second tier people. These were the insignificant people, and the real sort of demons of progress were the journalists who talked and talked and talked and talked and talked while other people did. And that was a continuation of our kind of class assumptions brought into the organization of alternative media, which very often really threatened their survival from within.
There is an interesting point here, though. Despite all of the political repression of the alternative media, despite all the internal turmoil of the different organizations that ran the alternative media, still they were basically the investigative reporters of the last few decades who have scooped all of the significant stories of our era way before the mainstream media. Just some examples. It was first in the alternative press we learned the truth about Vietnam. We learned the truth about the Kennedy assassination, that the Warren Commission was questionable, there very well could have been a conspiracy. We learned the truth about Watergate. We learned about environmentalism, the problems of women, of race, of class, the Native American movement problems. All of these surfaced years before in the alternative media than in the mainstream media. And to this day, if you really want to be informed in this society, you have to be plugged into alternative media, because the mainstream continues to censor certain stories and simply not to give you the information. But despite all the drawbacks and the problems that the alternative media have had over the years, we should also give them praise for the vanguard role that they played in this society in providing genuine information. But if you were to tell your students or friends what alternative media you would recommend to get genuine information, what would you recommend?
Okay, in terms of print media, I would say the Weekly in these times, the Utne Reader, which was mentioned earlier. I think that depending on your international interests, then things like the North American Congress on Latin America, Report on the Americas, which is a monthly. I think the MERIP, Middle East Research and Information Project report, which is, I think, is it monthly or quarterly? I can't remember these days. But anyway, that's real important on a very hot area of the world right now. And then there are probably locally, where depending where you live, there may well be some small radical newspaper that you can read there. I've been citing sources which are accessible nationally, but there may well be others locally which are real important.
What about those that keep up with the intelligence agencies, like Covert Action Information Bulletin, for instance?
Sure. I think it's amazing the amount of new and fresh information you can get out of a whole variety of these. And of course there's a whole bunch of environmental publications and feminist publications as well these days, all of which are important to recognize and important to keep up with.
In fact, I think Alternative Views has compiled a list of alternative print media that's accessible to the public that you can write us and get a copy of. We'll give you that information at the end of the show that'll force you to keep watching.
Well, let's talk about public access TV. In your book, which was, let's see, printed in what, 83?
84.
84. Right. Public access TV hadn't been all that well developed, and you looked at it kind of with a jaundiced eye. What has it developed much now? Have you changed your mind about public access TV?
Yeah, I think I have. I think because there are now something like, I think it's over 300 public access channels in the United States.
About over 2,000 now.
It's over 2,000. Yeah. Well, there you go.
It's really grown. Yeah.
So it's a much more significant presence than it was then. Also, at that point, the only examples, really, Canada was something of a front runner in this in the late 60s and early 70s, but very often the net effect of public access in Canada was not all that impressive at the time. So that would partly account for my jaundiced attitude then. Today, I think it's very important because it is the one video source where alternative views, small and large, can be seen and can be heard. There are, of course, a couple of problems associated with it. I mean, one is that you have to be able to afford cable in order to receive it, and that immediately cuts out a bunch of people right there. And second of all, by the nature of the definition of public access, the time is shared with totally repugnant organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and others. And so it's a medium which is also open to those people who are actively seeking to repress a section of the population, still further, even beyond the point at which they're repressed already. And so it's a flawed situation. But I still think that on balance it's a very positive one.
It certainly has been able to obviate a lot of the problems of the alternative press, particularly the print media, because it solves the problem of distribution, access to equipment at a very low cost or generally for free. And even if we're lucky, we raise $5,000 a year, and yet we have a national distribution of our program that goes maybe into 11 million or 12 million households. It obviates the need for a big staff, which in turn eliminates those staff problems with which all the infighting and I mean, Doug and I get along. I mean, sure. What the heck? We don't have to have those problems. Individuals can make their own stuff and put it right on. You don't have to have the great expense or the time. But there does seem to be a problem now with public access TV. Not including the fact that there are constant attacks on it at the local, state, and national levels, at the regulatory level, at the judicial level, and at the congressional level. But there does seem to be a problem with access that even George Stoney, who's considered the father of access at NYU, New York, has written about, and I see it here in Austin, and that is just the airwaves or the cable time is just being taken over by religious groups, by people just doing nothing, and there's nothing of any real significance, acting silly, or nothing of really significance as far as the society goes. So this seems to be a problem too now.
Yeah, I think part of the problem has been, in a way, access has now grown to be a kind of a micro-industry, at least in some places. I mean, now there are some access stations with budgets of 7 figures for the first time. And so somehow in the process of all the fights with the town hall, up and down the place, all the fights over one program out of maybe 5,000 offering whatever it might be, frontal nudity or some of the unacceptable words or whatever that gets some local citizens upset. In the process of all that, a lot of people have taken in Access have taken a very defensive line and a very overly professionalized line and have said, okay, we're just like the telephone company. We don't determine what goes out. We're simply a resource. And there's an element of truth in that, but there's also a very dangerous element of untruth in it, because I think it is the job of people in Access to make very active outreach efforts to those communities historically underrepresented in the media, and to make sure that those communities know that they are welcome to learn how to use the stuff and how to fill up the airwaves and begin to communicate their concerns not only to each other within their own community, but also to other communities that will, I'm sure in many cases, respond to the expression of those concerns. So
there's a certain responsibility, it seems to me, that public access TV has to compensate for the lack of democratic participation in the mainstream media. And that is that democracy is a dialogue. It's a debate with all the voices in society participating in discussion and expressing their needs, their problems, their views. And since the mainstream media cuts out so many groups, certain minorities, certain people of different political preferences, certain public interest groups, it seems to me that there's a responsibility for public access TV to ascertain what the needs are in their community, what the different groups are, what the different segments of the population are that don't usually get their voices articulated. On the other hand, it's the responsibility of people in those groups to take advantage of access and to use it to articulate their views to the public. But it seems that all this needs to be discussed between the Access Center and the community. So there is a certain responsibility in public access to really make democracy work when it comes to the media. And probably far too few access centers take this democratic responsibility seriously, which is why I think you have the problem of just getting overrun with garbage and missing some of the things that should be seen and heard in the community.
I couldn't agree more.
There's always one question in everybody's minds who do anything with either public access or with print media. You look to see how many copies are distributed, and you say 2,000 or 5,000 here, and they always tell public access people, well, nobody's watching. But is there a public awareness of the alternative press?
Well, I don't think there's a public awareness in the sense that if you took a national survey, that more than a tiny fraction of the population would be able to mention one single alternative medium. But at the same time, I think that will be a misleading index of the significance of these media. My example of choice is always that if you take a trip up to Boston Harbor and see the replica of the ship that they tossed the tea chests out of, it is minute by my standards. It doesn't look as though it could get more than about 5 miles offshore without maybe kind of being swamped by a wave. And the thought that something like that would have made the journey across the Atlantic repeatedly is hard to imagine. And I'm sure the chests of tea that they tossed overboard were also pretty small. They weren't giant kind of containers. The fact remains that the significance of that small action on that small boat in that small harbor kind of reverberated around America and helped to coalesce a whole movement of opposition to the repression which was coming from George III.